Hey YouTube, I decided to make a video about the Sawmill siding jig, and I just want to start off with a couple of, what it's made out of and stuff like that, and how I cut it and why I did what I did to a certain degree. Alright, so anyway, basically you're looking at everything I made, all these, whatever is white, okay, this white paper, consider that 3/16 inch steel plate, because that's what it was made out of. That's what I made it out of. Alright, so what you got here is you have a 3" by 1¼ piece, a 2" by 8¼ I think I said 1¼ It's 3" by 8¼ That's this piece. 2" by 8¼ and another 3" by 8¼ And what you do is you just put those together, make sure they're going to fit over your bunk. You can put some shims or a piece of 2x in there, whatever, before you weld it. After you weld that together and you have that piece that fits over the bunk, and I wanted that on the bunk because I didn't want to be scraping anything over the bunk I have right now. And if you realize, some guys have some stainless steel over their bunk rails. I don't have that, mine are painted. I'll probably do something about that in the future, but for now, this is how I made the jig. So all I have there is a channel, 2 inches wide, 3 inches long. On the end of that, I took 1.5 inches high by 2 inch wide piece of 3/16 and welded that, put a 90-degree angle in here and welded that. Now, you're better off not welding it over here, because if it's different here than it is on the other piece you're going to make 2 of these, then it may not line up nicely. So what I did was I welded on this side, okay? So keep that in mind, and there's a little work you got to do with that as well. But anyway, I welded this piece to this and this side. And then what I did was I took a file and I made sure that there was a straight line along here where the weld is. It doesn't matter how you build up the weld, just so that it's straight, okay? It makes the next piece easier to move on there. So basically that's what you have. I mean, that's not even basically, that's it. You have the channel, plus you have this tab that acts as a stop. Alright? So that's one thing. Okay, so we're going to set that to the side over there. Now the other thing is you need 3 more pieces. And all I did also real quickly was I just cut a 1/2 inch by I think 5 inch long piece for the handle for on the cam, to make this thing be one way or the other, and I'll show you that after. But here's what you need to do. You need to take another piece. You need another piece of 3/16, and I made this one 2.5 by 8¼ And the reason for the 2.5 is so that when I weld the sides onto this, piece, it'll be big enough to fit over top of this other piece and be able to go up and down. It doesn't have to be real big, but it has to have, enough play that it'll do it easily and doesn't bind up. So, you have to do your thinking as far as measuring. But anyway, this piece being rounded, it doesn't matter whether you cut it off here. Technically, you could actually take that piece you see there and weld it on there. Alright, it doesn't really matter. But you'll need to take pieces, and at the end, somewhere around the 8 inch mark from here over, you need to cut yourself a groove in there. Now, technically this groove, on the way I made this, and I'll just draw you a little sketch, would actually look something like this. So it's kind of like a key. But it doesn't have to be. It could be completely covering this whole thing. But what you need is you need at least a 1/2 inch one way and 3/4 inch the other way. That's what you need. So it has to be at least a 1/2 or 3/4, or it can be 3/4 in both directions. And what I recommend is when you cut these, if you use, say, like a grinder, or a drill, do it at one time and do it so that the top of it is in line with the top of these. Alright, so that's just basically a 3/4 inch hole. That's all that is, starting with the top here. And like I say, you can do it with a grinder or whatever you want. All this stuff I cut out with a grinder, a 4.5 inch disc grinder with a thin blade. That's all I use to cut this out. And as far as these go, it doesn't matter if it's straight, whatever. All this does is act to stiffen this piece. This is what the cant rests on, and you want that to stay flat. So it doesn't matter if you have a triangle or a rectangle or whatever you want under there. It doesn't have to look like this. It can be any shape, just so you have these holes over here that are big enough to fit 3/4 one way, 1/2 inch the other. Okay? That's what you need. Alright, so then what I did was, as I go beyond these shapes, I measured over 1/4 inch. I measured 1/4 inch from wherever the weld ended. Okay, say that's a bead of weld there. 1/4 inch over, and next to that line I welded a 1/4 inch pin, just like this. Now you can use a bolt, you can use pins, you can use whatever you want, but you need 1/4 inch over in there. So technically, with that pin welded in place from this side, this is done. This is finished, this part. Alright, so let's just set that to the side, and I'll set this bolt up here just to remind you that that's how, that's what that would have. I don't know if it's going to stay there, the heck with that. But anyway, it would be with this up and this bolt on here. Okay? The next thing you want to do is take another pin, 1/4 inch, and you go on the end here, and you weld that to the end of this piece of metal that the cant rests on. Just keep in mind, this is all 3/16, 2.5 by 8.25. You just take that 1/4 inch pin, weld it right into the center this way, throw a bead on there. Now what this creates is what's known as a breakaway hinge. Okay? The difference in this between a regular breakaway hinge and this is that it's not fastened at all. So what happens is, when you have, let me grab that bolt I dropped. When you have this piece on here welded, and you have this welded on here, and this is standing straight up, what happens is this bolt rests behind there, and it allows this to go up and down, and it doesn't have to go far. Okay? Now what you want to do is you want to make sure that you have enough room that this pin that's welded to here lays down on this steel. You don't want it hung up by the bolt or another pin, and you don't want it hung up on the weld, because if it does, it'll cause this to go sideways, or it may not fit in at all, and that'll mess up your cut. So all you're doing is putting a pin on the end of this piece, and you're going to set it between this bolt and this high piece of metal here. That's all you're going to do. Okay? So now that's that piece. Now keep in mind that that's welded on there. Okay? So once you get that welded on there, then what you do is you take and you weld these on, both sides. Make sure they're basically in line with one another, especially the ends here, like wherever you put them. They should be around the 8-inch mark somewhere. 8.25 inch mark, whatever. Just put them over there so that they fit good. Okay, so that they're at the end of the plate. Preferably right at the 8-inch mark. So you can move this whatever way you have to. Okay, after you do that, and now this is the tricky part, making the cam for this. So what I did was I took a piece of 1/2 inch rod. Alright, this is 1/2 inch. Actually it was 5/8. I had to put it in the lathe and cut it down. So I cut this down to 1/2 inch. Or you can use a 1/2 inch bolt. You could use the bolt as well. Alright, a long shoulder bolt though. You need at least 2 inches of straight bolt. You don't want to use the threads on any of this because it'll tend to chew away the metal. And then what I did to that 1/2 inch was I put it in a milling machine and I cut so that the distance from here, this flat side, to the bottom here was 1/4 of an inch. Now the reason for that is because of this. When I have this pin up here, and I have this turned like this, flat ways, okay, that makes the metal that's sitting on top of these level with the bunk. Alright? So that's why that's like that. Alright, so that's the flat way. Now here's where the complicated part comes in. First of all, let me just say to you, don't worry about a milling machine. You don't need a milling machine to do this. You can measure this out 2 inches wide or whatever width you need to fit over top of the channel you made. And you can grind that out with a grinder. This does not have to be, you know, within a couple thousandths. I have this thing within a thousandths of what I was trying to do, only because I had the time to play with it. Alright, so 1/2 inch bolt notched out to 1/4 of an inch of metal left. You could do it in the middle. You could take 1/8 and 1/8. It doesn't matter what you do. This is how I did it. It just started happening. Then I take another one of these pins. So you need 3 of these. One for here, one for the end of the part that goes where the cant is, and then you need one for on here. And what you do is you take this flat part, lay it on something flat. Now this ruler is not big enough and you wouldn't want to weld on that anyway. But you lay it on something flat so that you have the surface flat. And you put this pin, line the pin up so that it's, you know, going to be in the center there of where the cutout is. So you lay this flat and you set the pin on there, wherever it's supposed to be. Now the reason you're setting the pin on there like that is because the face of this and the face of the pin are going to be in line with one another. Alright, they're going to be like this. I don't know if you can see that, but they're going to be in line with one another. That's why you want to lay it on something flat. Alright, so once you lay it on something flat and you line this up, what I did was I threw a bead of weld in there. I welded it with a MIG welder, so I don't have a whole lot of sparking and arcing going on, okay? And then once that was welded, I turned it around and it was a little bit of a line in here, and I threw a bead of weld in there, okay? And then I went and I put it back in the milling machine, and again, you can use a grinder. I ground off the weld so it would be even with this flat surface. And then on this side, what I did was I took a dial caliper and I put it against here flat, and since this was already welded, now this is already welded in place, right? I welded that, I laid it the other direction, and I put it in the milling machine just to make sure that the weld was not higher than this 1/4 of an inch thickness that I need. Alright, so you have a 1/2 inch bolt milled down halfway, which is 1/4 inch. This is a 1/4 inch thick, and you take a 1/4 inch rod and put that on top of that and weld that on there. Now here's the next little thing that's gotta be, and if you don't do this, it's not going to work right. Because this is flat and wide, when you turn this flat, it stays on the bunk well. It stays on the jig here good. But when you go to turn it up, because the bottom of this is rounded and the bottom and the top of that is rounded, it won't stay the 3/4 inch way. It wants to fall over. So here's what I did then next. After I had this welded on here, I'm just going to hold it for now. After that was welded on, I put 2 beads of weld, one here and one over here. And I put them on there in such a way that they were higher than what the pin was. Now what that does is it takes this roundness and squares that up. Okay, it adds metal to this. Then I put it back in the milling machine. And again, you can take and you can use a grinder for that. But I made a flat surface, and the surface ended up being about maybe 1/4 to 5/16 wide, but it's a flat surface. Still maintaining the 3/4 of an inch from here to there. Okay? In other words, it's still 3/4 from here to here, but it's wider here because I added weld to it. And then I just ground that off. Then when you take this piece, now assume that you have this welded, okay? Assume you have that welded in there. You're going to take this, you're going to turn it a little bit, you're going to shove it in there, and when you turn this flat then on top of this, this is going to be flat. Now this is a little wider. Let me just cut this down a little bit, just for the sake of argument here. When you put this on, it's flat one way, okay? Could have been smaller yet. But when you turn it with this on it, you get 3/4. So what I did then was I took the handle, and when it was flat, I welded the handle down. So that, now in this case this would be on this side, but it doesn't matter, you just got to watch how you turn it. But I put the handle down because it's flat, 1/4 of an inch. Then when I turn the handle, okay, up, and this is welded on here, that gives me 3/4 of an inch. Now because I've already got a 1/4 inch pin back here and one on there, this 1/4 inch plus this 1/4 inch over here that's actually underneath here holding this up gives it a 1/2 of an inch of rise in 8.5 inches. So in other words, you're 1/4 here. When this is flat, you're 1/4 there. You turn it up 3/4, and because of that 1/4 back there, it gives you a 1/2 of an inch. And that's all there is to that. The things that I like about my idea was the handle, because the handle at a glance tells me what I'm cutting. Okay, whether I'm cutting the bevel or whether I'm cutting a flat piece to the cant. Now that may be important to you, it may not be. It's just something I liked, so it's easy for me to turn like that. All right, but that's how, this was the hard part to figure out, because when you go to put it in there, you know, how do you go from a 1/4 of an inch to 3/4 of an inch? So that's how you do it. You just take a 1/2 inch bolt, grind it out so it's going to fit over top of this. Okay, over top of that, grind it out, weld a 1/4 inch bolt if you wish on there, weld it, put some weld on this top corners. So in other words, what I'm getting at here is looking at that pin. Here's the pin basically being welded to the top of that piece. What I'm saying is you want to put weld here so that when you look at this, I'm just going to draw a piece like this. When you look at this from the opposite side, what happens is you get weld here, and that weld gives you a flat spot that clicks. When I turn this, you can hear it click. Like you can hear it click when I turn the handle down, it clicks down because the metal drops off this sharp edge to a flat point. And when I turn it to do the other way, when I have it here to do the bevel cut, the metal drops down off of an edge onto this flat point. Now you got to remember, you can't just have this 1/4 inch rod here. You got to have a flat point. If you put something bigger than that, you're going to end up grinding both sides. Keep in mind it has to be a 1/4 of an inch when you look at it this way. Okay, 1/4 of an inch, and that's all. And when it goes this way, it has to be 3/4. So you just have to be careful that you don't, you know, screw that up. I mean, if you put a 1/2 inch bolt on top of this bolt, you can easily grind it down. You'll be there for a while grinding, but you know, that's okay. But that's the shape you're after. You're after two flat sides, the one up here and the one that's going to be down here. As long as you have those flat sides, it'll click into place each way. You don't need to put a detent in there or nothing. And that's how that works. And that's all there was to that. And the other thing I'd like to say about this is, you know, keep in mind that you can take a piece of shim stock, you know, 8 inches long, and you can lay that on the bunk and you can cut siding with that. You just have to keep going after it and remembering, you know, did I drop something? Did I not drop the board? Or whatever. And I just wanted something that was easy to look at, easy to work with, and that's what this does. So you have this pin welded on there. That gets set to the side. you weld a pin on the very bottom of this. You weld the two sides onto here with holes big enough to get this cam through the hole. Okay? It's got to be like a 3/4 inch hole to get it through there. And then what I did was I put a washer on each side just to keep it from falling out, and a cotter key. That's all I did to keep it in there. And then you just turn it side to side or up and down, however you want to say, and that's how that works. So I also want to say to you that my original one out there that I made, I did not use a pin like this. I used a bolt, and I did grind it with a grinder most of the way, but I realized that the milling machine would give me a nice flat surface, especially when you put the 2 beads of weld on the top of the 1/4 inch, because it's really hard to take a good look at that and determine where 90 is to that by eye, and that's why I used the milling machine to do it. But you can do it and this doesn't have to be like, this doesn't have to be a 90 to this. It could be on a little bevel, as long as it's 3/4 of an inch from the bottom to wherever the bevel is. But it would be best if you had it straight up and then a 90 on there. Okay? In other words, this flat surface is 90 degrees to that. And as far as the pin goes and which way you work this, you want to figure out if the pin's coming in from the back side, you know, you may have to weld the handle one way, then opposite than it would be if it was coming in from the other side. So just, you know, pay some attention to that. For instance, if I put the handle on here, just to recap, if I put the handle on here, the handle would be down. And when I turn the handle up, that's when this piece then would go up like this. Alright? So if I have the handle in the wrong direction, like say I come in from the other side, if I have the handle down and I go to put this out, it'll still go up resting on that. It's just that that's not on the top, and it doesn't really matter. So there's not a lot of things you can do wrong with this. The only thing that's important is that you keep this level. You have to have it in a level position and a 1/2 inch higher than what level is. That's all you need. And that's how easy that went together. And like I say, I used a grinder to grind it. I was sitting there with my welder and a grinder, and once I'm doing dirty work like that, I really don't want to have to go to the milling machine, because it's a different frame of mind to jump from one thing to another, and I kind of don't like doing that. 3/16 inch steel plate. Cut out all the pieces, go from there. Okay? 2.5 by 8 1/4. 2 by 8 1/4, 3 by 8 1/4, 2 of them. These here are basically, you're looking at 3 inches, and again, you can cut this straight. It doesn't have to be on a curve, but you need something underneath there, and putting this underneath there makes this thing stay flat, nice and straight. And the bigger this piece is, the straighter that'll stay. So 3/16, the other day I cut 4 logs the other day, and one of the cants was 12 by 8, and that thing just laid on there nicely. It did no moving around, and everything stayed the way it should have. It just worked good. Alright guys, so that's the end of this video, and like I say, it was nothing but a rainy day. I should have stayed in bed today, but maybe with a little luck tomorrow I can try and hang some siding. Alright guys, bye.